Welcome to Frank Conversation here on Hard Copy. I am Terry Ikumi. Now, amidst the political activities that are taking over conversations, let us not lose sight of some other important issues and challenges surrounding us, one of which is the prevalence of HIV and AIDS in the country. Now, according to a UN AIDS statistics, Nigeria has the second largest HIV epidemic in the world. 3.1 million people as at 2017 were living with HIV. Now, the Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS, UNAIDS, has said it is planning to increase its investment in the fight against HIV and AIDS in Nigeria, just as many have urged the federal government to domesticate funding for HIV treatment. Encouraging HIV testing among the Nigerian population to ensure everyone knows their HIV status is key to any informed strategic plan, because without knowing the extent of how many people are living with HIV, it is hard to mitigate new infections and provide HIV treatment to all. Now, the federal government in June 2018 began conducting the Nigeria AIDS Indicator and Impact Survey to determine the true distribution of HIV and AIDS, hepatitis B and C in the country. And that was after the federal government signed a memorandum of understanding of about $91 million for the said survey. Now, tonight on Hard Copy, we'll find out the outcome and expected impact of that survey and where we are in the efforts to place more HIV-positive persons on treatment and prevent new infections. My guest is the Director General of the National Agency for the Control of AIDS, NACA, Dr. Sani Aliyu. Doctor, welcome to Hard Copy.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've recently concluded a survey on the National AIDS Indicator and Impact, and hopefully that's supposed to give us some data. Can you take us through some of the findings, even though I know the results are not out yet?
Yes, so you're quite right. The results are not out yet, but the actual field work finished end of December, just before Christmas. We feel that it's probably the largest single country HIV survey ever done in the world. We've sampled about 220,000 Nigerians throughout the country, all 36 plus 1 states. It's certainly the largest so far, and we expect the results to be out by March. At the moment, we're cleaning the data, doing some weighting, and doing some validation work as well.
What did it entail?
So what did it entail? It was a population-based household survey, by which I mean that we sample households. We do a randomization based on the scientific methodology, which is accepted internationally. And that random sampling gives us a pretty good idea. It's virtually like testing everybody in Nigeria, because the sampling is randomized. So at some point in time, we'll be able to give you fairly precise estimates. In fact, if you look at previous targets that we've been given, if we had been consistently hitting those targets, we would have had 1.5 million Nigerians by now on treatment. We only have 1.1 million, which means that there were issues about our methodology and where we were expecting people living with HIV will be. The areas that we've been testing, sometimes we have to test thousands and thousands in order to get one positive.
How were you able to access some of these hard-to-reach areas?
Well, I must say, I must really commend the staff that we have worked with in the field. They have been very committed. They have put their lives at risk. We've had episodes where some of the teams were almost kidnapped. We've had our teams going into very inaccessible areas, like Chibok, for instance. We went all the way into Chibok and parts of Borno State that would have been considered to be inaccessible. And I think the results we will get will be a further confirmation that as Nigerians, we actually have the skills to do excellent work.
I'm quite curious. We've had other HIV surveys, haven't yielded so much results. What's the difference between that on all those ones and what you've just done?
Size. The sample size. The sample size. The sample size is huge. 230,000 or 225,000 for a population of 200 million may not sound a lot, but remember, when similar surveys were done in Southern Africa, for instance, it was taking them a year to plan, a year to do, and a year to deliver. We did everything within 9 months. Mr. President launched the survey in June, July. We'll be getting final results in March. The sample size and the methodology is very different as well. The way we are doing it, we've poured a lot of resources between the US government and Global Fund. They've actually put in $91 million to get this job done.
For this, just for the survey?
Just for the survey. On average, the US government spends about $400 and something million every year on the Nigeria HIV program. So what they've done is they've actually put between them and Global Fund close to a quarter of what they would have spent.
Well, which brings me to the question. You just mentioned the contributions of the US and the Global Fund. About 95% of our funding for HIV comes from donors, which raises a question: is the government doing enough to show commitments to achieving the zero new infections by 2030 if we're not committing as much funds as we should and depending more on donors?
Terry, the current government has actually shown a lot of commitment and interest in people living with HIV. I can tell you for a fact that our budget for 2019, for instance, has been corrected. In the past, we used to be restricted to a budget envelope, but President Buhari has directed the Ministry of Finance and the Budget Office to stop putting us within a budget envelope because our patient numbers are not restricted to an envelope.
Well, since you mentioned the budget, the 2018 budget had about 2 billion or thereabouts budgeted for HIV treatment, and that was cut to about 1.1 by the National Assembly. Now, if you do a conversion to dollars, it's about $5.5 million. Would you compare that as treatment with $91 million, as you have already mentioned, that the international community has donated just for survey?
Yes, so you're quite right. The numbers might appear small, but if you look at the number of people on treatment, we have close to 60,000 persons on treatment, about 60-something thousand persons on treatment, courtesy of the government of Nigeria. It costs us 50,000 naira per patient per year. So that comes to about 3 billion. The President has kindly provided us with enough funds this year to meet the gap that has existed.
60,000 persons from what period?
60,000 persons per year. So we have 60-something thousand people on treatment in Taraba and Abia State at the moment. We have about 1 million on treatment courtesy of Global Fund and the US government. But we are growing those numbers. If we have committed to putting an additional 50,000 every year. So if we were to do that, gradually the number of people on treatment courtesy of the government program will go up.
But then again, one of the problems we seem to have with fighting the HIV scourge is testing and counseling. And it appears as though we don't have sufficient testing and counseling centers. What efforts have been made in this regard?
So actually, Terry, the number of testing centers has gone up considerably. But what we have realized is actually not the fact that testing is not happening. Efficient testing is not happening. The best way to test really is to go after those that have a high yield, what we call testing efficiency. It's much better to do 10 HIV tests and get 1 positive than to do 10,000 and get 1 positive, because each test kit is expensive and we know the resources available are limited. So in terms of community testing, the strategy is actually changing. Our partners, for instance, are now going to areas that have a much higher prevalence of HIV. So what we call the key population, so female sex workers, men who have sex with men, injection drug users. We are also going for people who have been identified to have HIV and testing their partners, because that's where you are most likely to get a positive. Our interest is not to say to you that I have tested 50 million Nigerians for HIV, and I've got 30,000 positive, for instance. I would be more interested in saying I've tested 1 million Nigerians and I've got a larger number.
There is a financial provision for these tests, right?
Oh yes.
But are you aware of some centers that still demand for money from some persons before they are tested?
And that's illegal and that's criminal. All the HIV testing we provide, NACA provides, or our partners, the US government and Global Fund, we provide them for free.
Do these tests extend to hospitals?
It does. So the private facilities obviously have the right to go and buy their own HIV test kits and to use them to test persons. But certainly in the public facilities where they are using HIV test kits, those HIV test kits are either provided by the federal and state governments, or they are provided by our partners, and they are provided for free.
So how accessible are these test centers? Some HIV counselors have observed that when it comes to testing for HIV, there's this issue of lack of access, basically because some people are not aware of the position that they should take or their rights when it comes to testing.
So you're quite right. There needs to be a lot more awareness when it comes to testing. But certainly the tests that are available in the public facilities should be for free. We have invested heavily in providing HIV test kits across the country together with our partners. We do have testing strategies, particularly our partners. As far as government is concerned, if you demand for a HIV test, we'll get you a HIV test. And we have a call center as well. If people are concerned or worried, if they call our call center, which is 6222, and we work Mondays to Fridays, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. If you call and tell us geographically where you are, we can give you information on the closest test center that you can go to for testing. But those test kits, those tests are supposed to be for free. And as I said, our strategy in the long term is to try and get every Nigerian living with HIV and put them on treatment. And the best way to do that will be to improve the efficiency of our testing.
Well, we've had reports of, or better still, there is available statistics that we have more women than men coming forward to be tested. Why? So there is a gender.
Yes, that is quite right. We have what we call the concept of missing men. Men tend to be macho, Terry, just like you. So you feel healthy, you don't want to go for a HIV test, you don't want to go to a hospital.
Or
if you have a headache.
Is it a case of discrimination?
Oh, no. I think it's more likely to be a cultural thing. Overall, there generally speaking, globally, there are more women living with HIV anyway. You tend to have almost like a 60-40 ratio, 60% women, 40% men, partly because of the anatomy, the nature, and the way transmission happens in women versus men. But the main problem, I think, with men is that men generally do not access health services until they get very sick. They will continue to do their normal activities. They will continue to drag themselves out of bed, and they don't generally like accessing medical services.
But what's NACA doing to encourage more persons to go out and get tested?
So we do a lot of awareness programs. We also have specific days like the World AIDS Day, the Valentine Day that's coming up, for instance, the Labor Day, May 1st, etc., where we do a lot of awareness building. We also provide HIV counseling and testing to certain sites that tend to have a high pickup. So, for instance, community testing. But generally speaking, nowadays, our priority is for every person who is positive and on treatment, we make sure that we follow up their contacts.
But does it appear as though we've gone past the stage of stigmatization? Because it seems like that's also one of the reasons why most people don't come forward to be tested, especially at the place of work.
So stigma and discrimination is still very much there, but we already have an act against discrimination. It's illegal for employers to test for HIV. Certainly it shouldn't influence whether or not they take people. There are certain jobs, like if you're a surgeon, for instance, you cannot be allowed to do certain surgeries if you have HIV unless you're virologically suppressed. But those are the only instances. It makes no sense for somebody who is going into an administrative job to have a HIV test done. It's wrong, and we have been pushing for examples to be made of employers that continue to break the law.
Let's talk about prevalence rates now and available data. I've had conversations that if the real prevalence rate of HIV in Nigeria is almost not certain because we don't have a very defined statistics to that effect, which probably explains why your website has 3.4% and the UNAIDS has 2.8%.
So just to say, the UNAIDS estimates are based on spectrum estimates, so they look at a range of things. They look at previous survey data. They also look at program data, which is taken every year. So every year we look at the number of people we've tested, the number of people that have been put on treatment, and that is mapped to previous survey results, and then they provide spectrum estimates. So that's the 2.8 million. The NACA, on the other side, what we have in NACA is based on what previous surveys have shown. And we have a responsibility as government to make sure that our data reflects surveys. But as I said, the surveys we've done in the past, I'm not saying they are wrong. What I'm saying is that the methodology was different, the sample size was different, and therefore they were not as robust as what we will be having now. Okay. And the confidence interval will be much wider, and therefore there will be some degree of uncertainty. But then that's why ourselves and our partners have put $91 million to sort out this problem.
We really have to go for a break now. When we come back, we'll talk some more. Sure. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm speaking with the Director General of the National Agency for the Control of AIDS, NACA, Dr. Sani Aliyu, on the recent HIV survey and prevalence in the country. Now, let's use the 2017 data that we had. South Africa has about 7.2 million people living with HIV, but they managed to place 61% of that population, adult population, and 58% of the children population on treatment. Now, Nigeria has 3.1 million people living with HIV, and we could only place 34% of the adult population and 26% of the children population on treatment. How do we achieve reduced HIV-related deaths when we cannot place a considerable number on treatment? Because at this rate, our HIV-related death is about 110,000.
So Terry, as I said earlier, it's not because we haven't tried. Both our partners and ourselves have been testing people for HIV. A lot of people, a lot of Nigerians for HIV every year. But we are failing to hit the targets that we have set for ourselves. And I think it's partly because we've been looking either in the wrong places, or the prevalence in some parts of the country might be very different to what we expect. I know you're trying to get out a figure for the HIV survey, the results, but I'm not going to tell you. All I can say is I think this conversation will be even more interesting in March when we release the results. So there are no projections from that survey as to whether there's been progress made, or are we getting it wrong? I don't want to preempt the results of the survey, but all I can say is it looks like Nigerians are very good at taking their medications when they are sick, and it looks like compliance is not a major issue. But in terms of the actual true burden of the infection, we will get those results. Here's something that's a worry to quite a number of people. Now, we have heard people complain of lack of antiretroviral treatment, and at a point we even heard of adults taking the pediatric antiretroviral due to lack of drugs. Is that recommendable? So no, it isn't. So as you're probably aware, Nigeria is a large country, so the logistics that has to do with distribution of drugs is actually quite a big one. But over the last 1-2 years, we've been able to harmonize all our drugs. So both Global Fund, the US government, and ourselves, when we buy antiretrovirals, we put them into a national pool, what we call a national pool. And then the drugs are distributed based on demand, so that we have stopped having expirations that we used to have in the past. The government of Nigeria looks after people living with HIV in just 2 states, Taraba and Abia, but we're still able to drag from the pool. But I wouldn't say Taraba and Abia have the highest prevalence in the country. Just because you don't want to let out the survey. You are trying to run before you've crawled, Terry. Let's look at one issue that some people have also responded to. It's the production of ARV, the antiretroviral. Some people have advocated for local production if we're to sustain HIV response in Nigeria. Where are we with that? So that's something that that's something that actually I really feel we need to push, and we have been working very hard in the last 1-2 years. So I'll tell you the problem with the local manufacture of these drugs. One, the regimens tend to change fairly rapidly, just like we're changing from TLE to TLD. So as a manufacturer, you need to be able to have that dynamism, that ability to be flexible, to suddenly change the drugs that you're manufacturing. Otherwise, you will end up outside the market. Secondly, we have what we call WHO pre-qualification. So the drugs need to pass certain standards when it comes to WHO standards for manufacturing. WHO pre-qualification can be very expensive for the local industry, and it's the main reason, in fact, that a lot of manufacturers in Nigeria, pharmaceuticals, are yet to start producing ARVs, antiretroviral drugs. It's very expensive, and you have to be able to maintain the quality, the standard, etc. I am fairly confident that in the coming years, especially as we try to get more investment from China and India, that generic drugs eventually will be manufactured for HIV in Nigeria. And when they do, if you recall, the Vice President launched the Executive Order Act. If they do, and we have a secure supply of antiretroviral drugs in the country, we will stop the importation of antiretroviral drugs.
Doctor, are these drugs free?
Oh yes, oh yes. So both our partners and ourselves, the drugs that we bring into the country, we do not sell them.
But then the network of people living with HIV and AIDS have complained that they're made to pay about 2,000 naira to access these drugs.
Yes, so you see the issue of user fees has been a very complicated one. There are aspects of health that that have to do with HIV, such as viral load testing for HIV, viral load testing for CD4 count. For instance, if you are on these medications, you shouldn't be charged for it. But there are also other aspects of biochemistry, let's say liver test, full blood count, that currently is not funded by our partners. And we also have issues where if you have somebody coming in, let's say you're running a clinic, patient number 1 has diabetes, you see him and you write a series of investigations, and he goes and pays. Patient number 2 has HIV, you see him and you need similar investigations that may not necessarily have to do with HIV, and you give him the form. The person with HIV, saying that the person with HIV should not pay, whereas the other person with diabetes should pay, straight away creates a situation of stigma and discrimination. My view is that with user fees should not be a barrier to accessing HIV care.
But then that's the problem. It also doesn't solve the problem of accessibility or availability of the drugs.
No, so what we intend to do, and the Honorable Minister of Health has agreed with me that this is probably the best way forward. If you recall, we've got the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund that was recently launched, where the country declared free antenatal care for all pregnant women, free care for children below the age of 5, and funding going directly to primary healthcare facilities to run those facilities. So we will be using part of the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund to say, if you have patients on treatment, let's say you have 100 people living with HIV on treatment, this part of the money that we'll be giving you should accommodate their basic investigations that's needed. And certainly, as far as I'm concerned, no person living with HIV should be charged a card in terms of accessing treatment. It's wrong. We cannot be spending huge amounts of money providing HIV drugs to centers, providing facilities. If you go to an average teaching hospital and you find a very nice lab or a very nice clinic, I can bet you it's going to be a HIV facility. So for those facilities to then start charging our patients, when in actual fact they are indirectly benefiting from the resources that we are bringing in, partly because of the people living with HIV that are on treatment in those facilities.
No, we're almost out of time now, but let's look at this issue of prevention of mother-to-child transmission, which contributes largely to new infections, and it seems as though it's not abating anytime soon. What's the problem with that?
So the problem with the prevention of mother-to-child transmission is a problem of health systems and the need for us to harmonize and have everything coming together. If you see a pregnant woman presenting and she needs a HIV test, it's not just a HIV test she needs. She needs full blood count, she needs malaria screening, she needs a check of her nutrition. So getting HIV as part and parcel of that component, in other words, looking at it as a bundle of care. But the main problem we've been having with prevention of mother-to-child transmission is the fact that only about 50% of pregnant women in Nigeria go for antenatal care. That is not the number you find in Rwanda. In Rwanda, more than 85% of the pregnant women access antenatal care. So for us to be able to get the bulk of women tested for HIV, we need to attract them to those facilities. And as the federal government is renovating primary healthcare facilities, making sure that ANC is available in every ward, high quality ANC is available within every ward. If we can latch onto that and make sure that HIV is considered as a component, and we're already doing that because we've moved from about 30% to about 40-45% of pregnant women now being tested for HIV.
How much progress do you hope to make when we have women in rural areas who have very who have difficulty accessing healthcare?
So there are other ways of accessing these women. So for instance, making use of traditional birth attendants. We're also starting to push for self-testing, HIV self-testing, so that we can give these test kits to antenatal facilities and ask the traditional birth attendants to also deliver these test kits to their pregnant women, to their clients, so that they can be tested in the comfort of their homes, and if it is positive, they can come to antenatal and be captured and then placed on treatment.
Dr. Ali, thank you so much for coming on Hard Copy.
Terry, it's a pleasure.
Well, thanks for watching. Send us your feedback using the email address and social media handles on the screen. You can also watch the interview again on our website, channelstv.com. Thanks for watching once again. I'm Terry Ikumi. Bye for now.